The vast darkness of space stretched out before Commander Ethan Cross as he sat in the cockpit of his battered ship, the Ironbound. The blinking lights of the control panel cast a faint glow on his face, making the hard lines of his jaw and his furrowed brows look even more rugged. It had been another long stretch of jobs, hauling cargo, running security, doing whatever it took to keep the fuel tank full and food on board. To Ethan, space was an endless frontier of endless risks, where survival was the only goal. But as he relaxed in the pilot's chair, his senses suddenly sharpened when a distress signal appeared on his radar. The signal was old-fashioned, almost primitive, yet clearly a cry for help. He leaned forward, adjusting the controls to enhance the signal, curiosity and caution flickering across his eyes. Distress signals in the lawless zones were a mixed bag. They were just as likely to be traps as genuine calls for help, but something about this one was different. There was an urgency in the voice breaking through the static that made him pause. It was faint, but the unmistakable sound of desperation sent a chill down his spine. "Help, please. This is Princess Lyra of the Earthian Empire. I am stranded. If anyone can hear this, I am in need of assistance." The words crackled through the comms, filling the silence with a plea that was both regal and pleading. Ethan's eyes narrowed, processing the information. An Earthian princess? Here, he scanned the surrounding coordinates. The signal's origin was a nearby planet, Voska. His knowledge of that desolate rock was limited, but he knew it was a place where only the most ruthless criminals dared to roam. The Earthians were a powerful alien race, known for their isolationist stance and advanced technology. They rarely mingled with other species, especially not in the darker reaches of the galaxy. It struck him as odd that a princess would be out here alone, and even stranger that she was asking for help from any stranger willing to listen. An Earthian princess in the middle of nowhere, he muttered, mulling it over. The signal looped, her voice growing fainter each time, making the urgency in her tone more pronounced. Ethan drummed his fingers on the console, weighing his options. Helping a stranded princess was the kind of job that could bring a lifetime of favors or trouble. The thought of involving himself with alien royalty, particularly from a race as mysterious as the Earthians, didn't sit well. Still, something in him pulled at the idea. Maybe it was the haunting vulnerability in her voice, or perhaps a long-buried sense of duty. As he continued listening, memories began surfacing, the faces of those he'd left behind, people he'd fought for and lost. In the silence of space, their voices seemed to echo, reminding him of promises made, of debts he owed to the universe. Ethan scoffed, shaking his head at his own sentimentality, but he felt a prick of obligation. He activated the thrusters, setting a course toward Voska before he could talk himself out of it. He rationalized it as just another job, but he knew better. The descent onto Voska was turbulent, with the atmosphere thick and oppressive. As he navigated through the clouds of dust and swirling debris, the landscape below came into focus. Jagged mountains, barren land, and a stretch of rocky terrain that looked as hostile as the planet's reputation. No wonder no one else had answered the call. Touching down on a safe patch, Ethan powered down the engines, took a breath, and geared up. He strapped on his pulse rifle, secured his blades, and double-checked the energy shield on his arm. The planet was notorious, and he wasn't about to walk into an ambush unprepared. Outside the ship, the air was thick with dust, and the distant sounds of shifting rocks echoed eerily. He moved cautiously, his senses sharp, scanning the horizon. It didn't take him long to locate the crash site. Smoke billowed from the wreckage of a small vessel, its hull bearing the intricate designs typical of Earthian craftsmanship. The sight was surreal, a symbol of elegance and power, shattered and abandoned in the midst of desolation. As he approached, he spotted movement among the debris. A figure emerged, slender and dressed in robes that were tattered and singed. Her face was obscured, but he could sense her tension, the poised but frantic energy of someone who had been hiding for too long. "Princess Lyra, I presume?" he called out, his voice low but carrying. The figure turned, her face partially revealed under a hood, eyes of an unusual iridescent shade fixed on him with both relief and wariness. She took a cautious step forward, her voice steady but soft. "You're human. Are you here to help?" Ethan allowed himself a small, reassuring smile, but kept his grip on his weapon. "That depends. Are you actually a princess, or am I walking into a trap?" She looked taken aback, and for a moment he thought he'd offended her, but instead she let out a faint laugh, almost bitter in its tone. "No trap, just an Earthian who trusted the wrong people." Ethan nodded, satisfied with her response for now. He motioned for her to move toward him, keeping his stance defensive. "All right, Then let's get you off this rock. As they began to move, she stumbled, clutching her side. Ethan caught her, noticing the deep gash along her ribs, blood staining her elegant robes. She was in worse shape than she let on. Despite her regal bearing, she was clearly exhausted and hurt. He couldn't help but feel a surge of respect for her resilience. "How bad is it?" he asked, his tone gruff but not unkind. "Just a scratch," she replied, her voice strained but determined. Ethan shook his head, muttering, "Typical royalty." He supported her weight as they made their way back to his ship, his eyes constantly scanning the area for any signs of trouble. He had learned to expect the unexpected in situations like this. As they neared the Ironbound, a warning beeped on his comm. He glanced at the radar, his heart sinking. Syndicate forces had picked up their trail, and they were closing in fast. His grip on Lyra tightened as he glanced at her with a grim expression. "Looks like the welcoming party's here." She looked at him, eyes filled with a blend of fear and determination. "I can't go back," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan nodded, his jaw set in a hard line. "Then let's make sure you don't." They picked up their pace, both understanding that survival now meant trusting one another. Ethan felt an unexpected surge of purpose as they reached the ramp to his ship, with the Syndicate forces almost upon them. As the engines roared to life, Ethan realized this was no ordinary job, and for reasons he couldn't yet explain, he didn't mind the risk. The Ironbound lifted off from the dusty ground of Voska with a low rumble, its engines churning to life as Ethan guided the ship into the atmosphere. Inside, the air was thick with tension, as he and Princess Lyra remained silent, both fully aware of the Syndicate forces closing in on them. The radar showed 3 ships in pursuit, each faster and more agile than his aging vessel. Ethan cursed under his breath, fingers dancing over the controls as he pushed the engines to their limit. Lyra winced as she clutched her side, the strain of the chase evident on her face. Despite her pain, she remained composed, watching the screens with a sharp gaze. Ethan noted her resilience, but he had little time to admire it as he executed a sharp maneuver to avoid incoming fire. Plasma bolts streaked past them, illuminating the cabin with bursts of light. "We won't outrun them for long," Ethan muttered, glancing over at her. "They're too fast, and the Ironbound wasn't built for fancy footwork." Lyra's jaw tightened, her fingers pressing into her side. "Then we have to outthink them. Do you have any countermeasures?" He smirked, flipping a few switches on the console. "Not the best, but they'll buy us some time." He triggered a release of chaff and flares, scattering bright lights across the radar to confuse their pursuers. The Syndicate ships wavered briefly, adjusting their formation, but soon enough, they were back on the Ironbound's tail. Ethan frowned, his mind racing as he calculated their options. The Syndicate wouldn't stop until they had what they came for, and Lyra's survival was now tethered to his ability to shake them off. He glanced at her again, weighing whether or not he could trust her in the heat of combat. "Ever handled a turret before?" Lyra raised an eyebrow, her face pale but resolute. "I've had some training. Show me where it is." He nodded, guiding her to the seat at the rear of the cabin. She winced as she strapped herself in, but her hands were steady on the turret controls. Ethan admired her bravery, knowing full well that this was far from the controlled settings of any training she might have had. Real space combat was a world apart. The targeting system lit up before her as the Syndicate ships closed in. Ethan's voice came over the comm, calm but urgent. "Aim for their engines. If you can disable one, it'll slow the others down." She nodded, determination flashing in her eyes as she focused on the nearest ship. Aiming carefully, she waited for just the right moment, and then fired. The turret recoiled as plasma rounds shot forth, a flurry of light and energy blazing through space. Her first shots missed, grazing the hull of the Syndicate ship but causing no real damage. Ethan grimaced. "Steady. Breathe. Don't rush it." Taking a breath, Lyra centered herself and took aim again. This time, she managed a direct hit to the nearest ship's engines. The impact sent it spinning off course, its thrusters sparking and sputtering. Her face lit up briefly with satisfaction, but her relief was short-lived. The other 2 ships adjusted, drawing closer as they returned fire with deadly precision. Ethan threw the Ironbound into a steep dive, dodging the incoming barrage as best he could. The ship's hull shuddered under the strain, and alarms blared, indicating shield depletion. He grimaced, muttering to himself as he calculated their next move. "We can't keep this up." Lyra's voice came through the comm, laced with urgency. "Do you have anywhere to hide?" He scanned the terrain below. They were approaching a cluster of canyons, their jagged walls rising like the teeth of some ancient beast. "Hold on. It's about to get rough." He angled the ship downward, weaving through the canyon network at breakneck speed. The Syndicate ships followed, but their formation broke slightly. allowing a glimmer of hope. Ethan felt a surge of adrenaline as he pushed the ironbound to its limits, twisting and turning through the narrow canyon walls. Rocks and dust kicked up in their wake, creating a turbulent path that made it difficult for the syndicate to maintain their pursuit. Lyra, now steady with the turret, fired strategically, forcing their enemies to evade or risk a direct hit. The syndicate ship struggled to navigate the sharp turns and narrow passages, but they pressed on, determined to catch their prey. Ethan's hands were a blur on the controls, his mind focused solely on survival. Just as they reached the narrowest part of the canyon, one of the syndicate ships drew close, its weapons locking onto the ironbound. Ethan's gaze flicked to Lyra. "Now! Take it out!" Without hesitation, she fired, hitting the enemy ship dead on. It exploded in a fiery blaze, shards of metal scattering across the canyon walls. The explosion rocked the ironbound, but Ethan managed to regain control, steering them upward and out of the canyon just as the final syndicate ship fired another barrage. With two of their pursuers down, only one remained. The last ship was faster, more relentless, and its pilot seemed intent on finishing the job. Ethan gritted his teeth, feeling the weight of exhaustion bearing down on him. He knew they couldn't last much longer. Suddenly, Lyra leaned over, her gaze intense. "I have an idea. Set a course toward that asteroid field up ahead." He hesitated, glancing at the chaotic mess of floating rocks in the distance. "You're serious?" She nodded, her eyes blazing with a fierce determination. "Trust me, I know how they operate. They'll follow us, but they won't expect us to navigate through there." Ethan took a steadying breath. "All right, let's do it." He adjusted their trajectory, aiming the ironbound toward the asteroid field. The last syndicate ship followed, closing the distance as they entered the treacherous field. Massive asteroids drifted around them, each one large enough to pulverize their ship on impact. As they weaved through the maze of rocks, Lyra continued firing, creating a trail of debris that the syndicate ship struggled to navigate. She was relentless, her focus unyielding, and for a moment, Ethan was struck by the thought that she was more than just a stranded princess. She was a survivor, as fierce and determined as any warrior he'd met. The syndicate ship fired, its shots narrowly missing the ironbound as Ethan dodged and rolled, his movements precise and practiced. The asteroid field was thickening, and he could feel the pressure mounting. His fingers gripped the controls tightly, his heart pounding in his chest as he steered them through the chaos. Then, at the last moment, Lyra's turret locked onto the syndicate ship. She took a deep breath, steadied her aim, and fired one final shot. The plasma bolt struck the ship's cockpit, and within seconds, it erupted into a fiery explosion, scattering fragments into the cold void of space. Ethan let out a sigh of relief, his shoulders slumping as the immediate danger passed. He glanced at Lyra, who was breathing heavily, her hands trembling slightly from the intensity of the battle. They were both exhausted, but alive. He gave her a nod of approval. "Not bad for a princess," she smirked, leaning back in her seat. "Not bad for a mercenary." For a brief moment their eyes met, and there was a silent understanding between them. They were no longer strangers thrown together by chance. They were allies, bound by survival, and for now, that was enough. As the ironbound stabilized in open space, the adrenaline rush began to wear off, leaving Ethan and Lyra in a tense silence. The weight of what they'd just been through lingered in the air, making the small cabin feel even more cramped. Ethan guided the ship into a quiet sector, away from prying eyes and sensor sweeps, then set it on autopilot before unstrapping himself. He glanced over at Lyra, whose face was pale from both exhaustion and the strain of her injuries. "Come on," he said, gesturing toward the med bay. "Let's get that wound looked at before you bleed all over my ship." Lyra shot him a defiant look, but she allowed herself to be helped out of the turret seat. She'd kept her composure through the battle, but Ethan could tell she was nearing her limit. He led her to a small, dimly lit compartment at the back of the ship, where he kept his medical supplies, a haphazard assortment of bandages, antiseptics, and old military-grade field dressings. As she settled onto the makeshift bed, she glanced around the cramped space, taking in the worn-down walls and exposed wiring. "Is this ship always so?" She hesitated, searching for the right word. "Lived in?" Ethan smirked, pulling out a med kit. "It's no royal cruiser, but it's gotten me out of more scrapes than I can count. Now hold still." He knelt beside her, carefully peeling back the fabric around the wound on her side. It was deeper than he'd expected, the edges dark and swollen, but it hadn't hit anything vital. He worked in silence, cleaning and dressing the wound, his hands practiced and steady. Lyra watched him closely, her expression softening as she studied his face. "You seem experienced at this," she remarked quietly. He shrugged, not looking up. You don't make it far in my line of work without picking up a few survival skills. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the hum of the ship's engines. Lyra broke the quiet, her tone thoughtful. Why did you answer my call for help? Ethan hesitated, caught off guard by the question. He could have told her it was curiosity or maybe the allure of potential profit, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. He'd spent too many years running from one job to the next, driven by survival rather than purpose. Something about her plea had awakened a sense of duty he thought he'd buried long ago. I don't know, he finally replied, avoiding her gaze. Maybe I just couldn't ignore it. Lyra tilted her head, studying him with those striking eyes of hers. There's more to you than you let on, Ethan Cross. He gave her a wry smile. And you're a lot tougher than you look, Princess. They shared a small, understanding nod, each respecting the other's resilience. Despite the unspoken tension, there was a sense of camaraderie forming between them, an alliance born out of necessity, but with the potential to be something more. After tending to her wound, Ethan moved to the cockpit, settling into the pilot's seat. Lyra joined him a few minutes later, easing herself into the co-pilot's chair with a wince. She seemed deep in thought, her gaze fixed on the endless expanse of stars outside. Do you have a plan? He asked, breaking the silence. She didn't answer immediately, her brow furrowed as she contemplated their next move. I was on a diplomatic mission, she finally said, an attempt to negotiate peace with the factions on the border of our empire. The Syndicate must have seen it as an opportunity to weaken our family's influence. She paused, a hint of bitterness creeping into her tone. They're powerful, ruthless, and have connections everywhere. They won't stop until they've captured me or, worse. Ethan listened, understanding the weight behind her words. The Syndicate wasn't just a gang of petty criminals. They were an organized network with deep ties across the galaxy. Even a princess from a powerful empire like the Earthlings wasn't safe from their reach. Why would they go to all this trouble? He asked. What's so important about capturing you? Lyra hesitated, then looked away. There's something I know, something my family holds. It's not just about me, it's about what they can gain if they have control over our empire. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Something valuable? Something beyond value, she replied cryptically, a troubled expression crossing her face. Let's just say, in the wrong hands, it could change the balance of power in the galaxy, and the Syndicate knows that. The weight of her words sank in, and Ethan felt a renewed sense of urgency. Whatever Lyra was involved in, it was far bigger than a simple rescue mission. If the Syndicate had its sights on her, and the knowledge she carried, their intentions could threaten not just her empire but countless worlds. So, where does that leave us? He asked. Lyra turned to him, her gaze unwavering. It leaves us with few options. We can try to make it to a nearby neutral system, find allies, and regroup, but we'd have to be careful. As I said, the Syndicate has spies everywhere. Ethan considered her suggestion. It was a long shot, but it was better than wandering aimlessly with a target on their backs. He tapped a few buttons on the console, pulling up the star map. There's a trade hub a few sectors over, called Epsilon Station. It's neutral ground, somewhat of a safe haven for people looking to avoid unwanted attention. If we can make it there, we might be able to gather intel, or at least buy ourselves some time. Lyra nodded, her expression resolute. Then Epsilon Station it is. As Ethan set a course, he noticed her eyes drifting shut, her exhaustion finally catching up with her. He wondered how long she'd been running, how much she'd sacrificed to keep herself alive. In her sleep, her face softened, revealing a vulnerability she kept hidden while awake. The burden she carried was heavier than he'd realized, and for a moment he felt an uncharacteristic pang of protectiveness. Turning his attention back to the controls, he double-checked their trajectory, knowing full well that the Syndicate wouldn't be far behind. Their recent skirmish might have bought them some time, but it wouldn't keep them safe for long. Every moment counted now. Just as he began to relax, a light on the console started flashing, a proximity alert. Frowning, he tapped a few buttons to magnify the sensors. His stomach dropped as he saw a small fleet of Syndicate ships in pursuit, their unmistakable profiles highlighted on the radar. Damn it, he muttered under his breath, his muscles tensing. Lyra stirred beside him, her eyes fluttering open as she sensed his unease. What's wrong? Ethan's jaw tightened as he turned to face her. The Syndicate's back and they brought reinforcements. Looks like they're more determined than I thought. She paled but quickly regained her composure, straightening in her seat. How many? Too many, he replied, his mind racing through their options. We're outgunned and outnumbered. If we try to fight them here, we won't stand a chance. Lyra's gaze hardened, her voice calm but urgent. Then we need to lose them. Can we make it to Epsilon Station before they catch up? Ethan calculated their distance and speed, the odds stacking up against them. It's risky, but if I push the engines to max, we might just make it. He glanced at her, a determined glint in his eye. But it's going to be close. Without hesitation, she nodded, her expression resolute. Do it. Ethan grinned, feeling a surge of adrenaline as he cranked the engines to their limits. The Ironbound roared as it shot forward, streaking through space with renewed vigor. The Syndicate ships gave chase, but Ethan and Lyra held fast, hurtling toward Epsilon Station and whatever safety, or danger, awaited them there. Epsilon Station loomed ahead, its sprawling structure nestled amidst the hazy glow of nearby nebulae. Unlike other stations, Epsilon wasn't aligned with any faction or government, making it an oasis of neutrality in a galaxy torn by rivalries and power struggles. Ethan breathed a small sigh of relief as he maneuvered the Ironbound toward the station's docking port. Here, at least, they might find some respite from the Syndicate's relentless pursuit. As the ship settled into the docking bay, the familiar clanking of metal echoed around them. Lyra, now visibly better after a short rest, stood beside him, her gaze set on the bustling scene unfolding through the cockpit window. The station was a labyrinth of metal and flashing lights, filled with people of every species and affiliation. Traders, smugglers, exiles, and adventurers wandered the decks, each carrying their own secrets, each another potential risk. Ethan shut down the engines, his eyes scanning the crowds for anyone suspicious. All right, Princess, here's the plan. We keep a low profile. This station might be neutral, but credits talk, and the Syndicate can buy loyalty as easily as anyone else. Lyra nodded, pulling up her hood to hide her face. Understood. I'll follow your lead. They disembarked from the Ironbound, blending into the flow of foot traffic as they moved toward the station's bustling market district. Ethan kept his hand near his blaster, his gaze constantly scanning their surroundings. He had been on Epsilon Station more times than he cared to count, but this time felt different. Every shadow seemed to hide an enemy, and every passing glance felt like a threat. They found a quiet corner at a small, dimly lit cantina on the outskirts of the market. Ethan leaned back in his seat, his eyes sharp as he watched the door, while Lyra sipped cautiously at a lukewarm drink the bartender had insisted was safe for all species. So what's next? Lyra asked, her voice low but firm. We can't keep running forever. Ethan exhaled, the weight of their situation settling heavily on his shoulders. We need information. If we're going to have any chance against the Syndicate, we have to know who we're dealing with, what they're planning, and how far their reach extends. She looked thoughtful, tapping her fingers against the table. There might be someone here who can help us. I once heard of an engineer named Rin, who used to work with the Syndicate but left under complicated circumstances. He could know their weaknesses, maybe even help us find a way to neutralize their operations. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Sounds like a risk. Ex-Syndicate types don't usually take kindly to visitors asking questions. Lyra met his gaze, a determined gleam in her eye. I don't have many options left, Ethan. If he can help us, it's worth the risk. Before he could respond, a figure slid into the seat across from them. He was a scruffy man with a mop of dark hair and a mechanical eye that whirred as it adjusted to focus on them. He looked every bit the rogue engineer, dressed in a mix of mismatched gear with various tools strapped to his belt. You two are making quite the spectacle, he said, his voice a low drawl. You might as well have put up a sign saying, "Wanted by the Syndicate." Ethan tensed, his hand instinctively moving to his blaster. Who are you and what do you want? The man held up his hands in mock surrender, a crooked smile playing on his lips. Relax. I'm not here to cause trouble. Name's Rin. Word on the station is that a certain Arathian princess and her human escort were looking for information. Figured I'd save you the trouble of tracking me down. Lyra's eyes widened slightly, but she kept her composure. You're Rin, the one and only, he replied with a smirk. And you're Lyra, Arathian royalty, if I'm not mistaken. He leaned forward, his tone suddenly serious. You do realize the Syndicate's got a hefty bounty on your head, right? They're not going to stop until they get what they want. She nodded, her gaze steady. That's why we're here. We need your help, Rin. I know you have a history with the Syndicate. If there's anything you can tell us about their operations, their weaknesses, we'd be grateful. Rin scoffed, leaning back in his chair. You're asking a lot, Princess. Crossing the Syndicate isn't exactly my idea of a good time. They don't take kindly to former employees meddling in their affairs. Ethan crossed his arms, his tone firm. Look, we're not asking you to take on the Syndicate alone. Just give us what you know, and you're out of it. Rin's mechanical eye focused on Ethan, sizing him up. After a tense moment, he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. All right, fine. I'll give you a little intel, but don't expect me to stick around if things get messy. He pulled out a small datapad, tapping a few buttons before sliding it across the table. There's a shipment coming through in 2 days. Earthian tech, the rare kind. The syndicate plans to sell it off to a high-bidding buyer. If they get their hands on this tech, they'll have leverage over half the galaxy. Lyra's eyes narrowed as she looked over the data. Why do they need it so badly? Rin leaned closer, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. They're building something big. Rumor has it they're piecing together old tech from various alien races, trying to create a super weapon. Whatever it is, they're throwing everything they have into it. Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. The syndicate with a super weapon was the last thing the galaxy needed. He exchanged a look with Lyra, the urgency clear between them. So, where is this shipment? It's coming in on a freighter to dock C-37, heavily guarded, Rin said, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening. If you're planning on intercepting it, you're going to need more than just luck. And once they realize you're onto them, they'll hunt you down like animals. Lyra clenched her fists, her gaze steely. If it means stopping them, we'll do whatever it takes. Rin raised an eyebrow, impressed by her determination. Well, good luck with that. You'll need it. He got up to leave, but paused, glancing back at them. One more thing. There's someone else in the syndicate who might help you, if you can find her. Her name's Zara. Let's just say she's not exactly loyal to their cause. Ethan's curiosity piqued. Why would she help us? Rin shrugged. She has her reasons. You'll find her near the lower docks, but don't expect her to trust you easily. The syndicate's her family, for better or worse. With that, he slipped away into the crowd, leaving Ethan and Lyra alone with the datapad and a plan that felt dangerously thin. Ethan pocketed the device, his mind racing through the next steps. So, we intercept the shipment, try to disrupt their operations, and hope Zara doesn't turn us in. Lyra met his gaze, a fire in her eyes that Ethan hadn't seen before. Yes, we can't let them continue unchecked, especially if they're after technology that could shift the balance of power. He exhaled, his shoulders tense with the weight of what they were about to attempt. All right, Princess. Looks like we're taking on the syndicate. As they left the cantina and headed toward their ship, the reality of their alliance settled in. They were two unlikely partners, bound by a shared enemy and an even more dangerous goal. The syndicate was ruthless, powerful, and well-connected, but for the first time, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. Lyra wasn't just another job. She was a force all her own, a fighter willing to put herself at risk for something greater. With Rin's intel and a dangerous mission ahead, they steeled themselves for what was to come, knowing that this uneasy alliance would be their only chance to survive. 2 days had passed since Ethan and Lyra first arrived on Epsilon Station, gathering intel and preparing for the next phase of their mission. The syndicate shipment carrying precious Earthian technology was scheduled to dock at C-37 in a matter of hours. Ethan leaned against the wall of a cramped maintenance corridor overlooking the docking area, his eyes locked on the guarded bay below. Beside him, Lyra adjusted her hood, concealing her face as she peered out, her posture tense but composed. Once the shipment's secured, we'll need to move fast, Ethan murmured, glancing at her. The syndicate won't take kindly to someone meddling in their business. I'm guessing we have about 10 minutes tops before they're onto us. Lyra nodded, her gaze steady. Understood. We've been through worse, haven't we? Ethan raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on his lips. Maybe you have, Princess, but the stakes are a bit higher this time. Despite the gravity of the situation, a faint smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. Let's hope we're up to the challenge. A low hum vibrated through the station as the syndicate freighter docked, its massive hull gleaming under the dim lighting of Epsilon's lower decks. Armed guards emerged, taking their positions around the perimeter, each one alert and ready. Ethan took a breath, scanning their formation and noting weak points they could exploit. We'll need a distraction, he said, glancing at Lyra. Something to draw the guards away from the main entrance. Once they're scattered, we'll slip in, grab what we can, and be gone before they realize what's hit them. Lyra pulled out a small device, a compact EMP emitter she had managed to acquire earlier. This should do the trick. It'll take out their comms and create enough chaos to cover our entry, but we'll have to move quickly. It only buys us a few minutes. Ethan nodded, impressed. All right, Princess, you're full of surprises. With the plan set, they waited for the right moment, tension building as the guards settled into their routine. Lyra activated the EMP device, and with a subtle flick of her wrist, she tossed it toward the freighter's control panel. A faint pulse rippled through the air, and within seconds, The lights around the dock flickered and went dark. The guards looked around in confusion, their radios crackling with static as they tried to re-establish communication. Ethan and Lyra seized the opportunity, slipping past the guards and into the loading bay. The interior was dimly lit by emergency lighting, casting eerie shadows across the crates and containers stacked high around them. They moved quickly, their steps muffled against the metal flooring as they navigated the labyrinth of cargo. "Stay close," Ethan whispered, leading the way as they made their way to the main cargo hold. He pulled up a rough schematic on his wrist device, guiding them through the twists and turns. Finally, they reached the container marked with the Syndicate's insignia, a menacing red symbol of power and control. "This is it," he muttered, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "Let's get it open and see what we're dealing with." Lyra knelt beside the container, her fingers deftly working the lock. She cracked it open, revealing a trove of technological components, advanced weapons, energy cores, and strange devices with glowing inscriptions that pulsed with an otherworldly energy. She sucked in a breath, her eyes widening as she took in the scope of what they'd uncovered. This is Earthian technology," she whispered, awe and worry mingling in her voice. "These devices are ancient, some of them even sacred. If the Syndicate has access to this kind of power..." Ethan's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of her words, the implication of what could happen if the Syndicate wielded such advanced and powerful tech. "Then we can't let them keep it. Grab what you can." They began loading as many pieces as they could into small satchels, prioritizing the most volatile components that would cripple the Syndicate's plans if they were lost. But just as they secured the last of the equipment, the echo of footsteps sounded from down the corridor. Ethan tensed, signaling for Lyra to stay quiet as he listened. "Someone's here," a gruff voice muttered, followed by the distinct sound of weapons being drawn. Ethan and Lyra exchanged a look, their minds racing. Their cover was blown and there was no turning back. He tightened his grip on his blaster, his senses heightened as he calculated their escape route. "This way," he whispered, leading her down a narrow passage between stacks of cargo. They slipped through the shadows, keeping low as the guards' footsteps drew nearer. They were almost to the exit when a flash of movement caught their eye. A Syndicate guard rounding the corner, his weapon raised. Ethan didn't hesitate. He fired a single shot, taking the guard down before he could raise an alarm. The sound, however, alerted the others. Shouts erupted, and within moments, the entire dock was alive with the thundering of boots and the crackling of blaster fire. Ethan and Lyra broke into a sprint, weaving between crates and ducking behind cover as they made their way back toward the dock's main entrance. Plasma bolts whizzed past them, striking the metal walls and filling the air with the acrid scent of burned circuitry. Ethan took a quick glance over his shoulder, assessing the number of guards. "We're outnumbered and outgunned," he growled, dodging another round of fire. "Got any more tricks up your sleeve?" Lyra's face was grim as she pulled out another small device from her cloak, a portable shield generator. "This won't hold them off for long, but it'll buy us a few precious seconds." She activated the shield, a shimmering barrier forming around them as they continued their escape. The guards' shots bounced harmlessly off the barrier, but Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before the generator's energy depleted. "We're almost there," he shouted, steering them toward the exit where the Ironbound waited. But just as they neared the dock's entrance, a towering figure stepped into their path, blocking the exit. It was none other than Commander Zarek, a high-ranking Syndicate officer whose reputation was infamous across the galaxy. Well, Zarek sneered, his eyes gleaming with malice. "I never thought I'd see a princess and a rogue mercenary stooping to thievery. I expected more from the Earthian royal family." Ethan tightened his grip on his blaster, every muscle tensing as he sized up their formidable opponent. "Let us through, Zarek, or this gets ugly." Zarek chuckled, his voice dripping with contempt. "Oh, I'm counting on it, Cross. The Syndicate has a special bounty on your heads, and I intend to collect." Without warning, he lunged, moving with a speed that belied his size. Ethan barely had time to react, dodging to the side as Zarek swung a massive metal fist at him. The blow missed him by inches, slamming into a nearby crate with enough force to send fragments flying. Lyra activated her blaster, firing at Zarek with pinpoint precision. The shot struck his armor, but he shrugged them off, advancing with an almost mechanical relentlessness. She backed up, her expression fierce as she continued firing, each shot deflected by his armored suit. Ethan saw his opening and moved quickly. Circling around Zarek and targeting a weak spot near the base of his spine, he fired, the shot hitting true, and Zarek staggered, gritting his teeth as he turned to face Ethan with a snarl. "You'll regret that, Cross," Zarek growled, his voice filled with fury. Ethan met his gaze, unflinching. I already regret a lot of things, Zarek, but helping her isn't one of them. With a final surge of effort, he and Lyra struck in unison, coordinating their attacks in a flurry of motion that overwhelmed Zarek. He stumbled back, disoriented, and they seized the chance, breaking past him and sprinting for the ship. As the Ironbound's engines roared to life, Ethan threw a glance over his shoulder, catching a glimpse of Zarek's livid face as they lifted off. The Syndicate had been dealt a blow, but he knew this victory was just the beginning. Their enemies would come after them with everything they had, but he was ready. For the first time, he had a cause worth fighting for, and an ally who was just as committed to seeing it through. The Ironbound tore through the black expanse of space, engines roaring as Ethan pushed the ship to its limits. The battle at Epsilon Station had left their escape tenuous at best, and even now, the Syndicate ships were close behind. Alarms blared across the cockpit, red lights flashing a warning as Lyra braced herself in the co-pilot's seat, her face set in grim determination. "How close are they?" she asked, barely glancing at the radar. The steady beeping confirmed what they already knew. The Syndicate wasn't letting them go without a fight. "Too close," Ethan grunted, twisting the controls to dodge an incoming plasma bolt. "They're faster than us, and the Ironbound's shields won't hold for long. We need a plan, and fast." Lyra nodded, scanning the console for options. "We could try the asteroid field near Gentaris. If we can lose them in the rocks, we might have a chance." Ethan considered the idea, weighing the risks. The Gentaris asteroid field was dense and unpredictable, but it was also their only option. "All right," he agreed, adjusting their trajectory. "Hold on tight." The Ironbound shifted course, veering toward the dark silhouette of the asteroid field looming ahead. Ethan's hands were steady on the controls, but he could feel his pulse racing. Flying through a field of massive, drifting rocks was dangerous enough on its own. Doing it with a fleet of hostile Syndicate ships on their tail added a whole new layer of risk. As they entered the field, the surrounding space darkened, the massive asteroids casting shadows that stretched like claws across the cockpit. Ethan maneuvered carefully, weaving between the rocky giants as they drifted in slow, ominous patterns. Behind them, the Syndicate ships followed, though more cautiously, their pilots clearly hesitant to engage in such a treacherous area. "Keep your eyes peeled," Ethan warned, glancing at Lyra. "They won't give up that easily." No sooner had he spoken than a Syndicate fighter broke formation, zooming into the asteroid field with blasters blazing. Lyra ducked as a shot scraped past their hull, sending a shower of sparks across the console. Ethan cursed, twisting the ship hard to the left, narrowly avoiding a collision with a massive chunk of spinning rock. "They're getting desperate," Lyra observed, her voice calm despite the chaos. "They know if we escape, it'll be their heads on the line." "Good," Ethan replied, a fierce smile on his face. "Let them make mistakes." With Lyra manning the rear turret, they returned fire, each shot forcing the Syndicate ships to swerve, dodging both plasma bolts and tumbling asteroids. The Ironbound darted through the field like a hunted animal, moving with agility and precision. Ethan's focus sharpened, his every move calculated as he anticipated the path of the rocks and the enemy's attacks. But just as they began to outmaneuver the Syndicate ships, another threat appeared on the radar, a large, heavily armed cruiser blocking the asteroid field's exit. Ethan's heart sank as he recognized the outline of the vessel. It was a Syndicate battlecruiser, bristling with enough firepower to decimate them in seconds. "They've got us cornered," Lyra said, her voice tense. "They're forcing us back into the field." Ethan's mind raced, searching for an escape. The battlecruiser was too powerful to engage head-on, and turning back would only lead them deeper into the deadly maze of asteroids. But then an idea sparked, a risky, near-suicidal maneuver, but their only chance. "Do you trust me?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. Lyra looked at him, eyes steady. "I wouldn't be here if I didn't." Taking a steadying breath, Ethan banked the Ironbound hard to the right, aiming for a cluster of closely packed asteroids. The Syndicate ships followed, cautious but relentless, closing in on all sides. With practiced precision, Ethan guided the ship through a narrow gap, each movement tight and exact as he wove between the rocks. The Syndicate fighters, however, were not as fortunate. One ship clipped an asteroid, spiraling out of control before exploding in a brilliant flash. Another swerved too late, its wing torn off by a massive rock, sending it careening into oblivion. Lyra watched, admiration flickering in her gaze as Ethan continued to outmaneuver their pursuers. But the battlecruiser was still waiting, and the gap to safety was closing fast. Ethan's fingers gripped the controls, every nerve on edge as he pushed the Ironbound to its limits. "Prepare for impact," he shouted, his voice strained as he aimed directly at a small opening in the cruiser's formation. It was a risky gambit, but if he timed it just right, they could break through. With a final burst of speed, the ironbound shot forward, squeezing through the gap just as the cruiser unleashed a barrage of fire. Plasma bolts grazed the hull, but they slipped past, emerging from the asteroid field and into open space. The Syndicate ships fell back, unwilling to pursue further, and the radar went blissfully silent. Ethan slumped in his seat, exhaling a long, relieved breath. "We did it," Lyra smiled, the tension melting from her face. "I had no doubts." As they distanced themselves from the asteroid field, Ethan set the ship to autopilot and turned to Lyra. "We can't keep running like this. They'll keep coming after us no matter where we go." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Agreed. We need to go on the offensive, find a way to cripple their operations. If we can take out their command center or disrupt their communications, we might stand a chance." Ethan arched an eyebrow, intrigued. "Do you have any idea where their main base is?" Lyra hesitated, then nodded. "I do. During my time on Earthian intelligence missions, I intercepted data on a hidden Syndicate outpost. It's heavily fortified, but if we can infiltrate it, we might be able to locate their command center, or at least gather intel on their network." Ethan considered this, a spark of hope igniting. "Sounds like a long shot, but it's better than being hunted down." Lyra's face hardened, a fire in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. "The Syndicate has caused too much destruction, too much pain. If there's a chance to take them down, even a small one, we have to take it." He studied her, admiration mingling with a hint of surprise. "You know, Princess, you're not exactly what I expected." She smirked, folding her arms. "I've never fit the mold of a typical Earthian royal. I don't intend to start now." They shared a moment of silent understanding, their alliance no longer just a matter of survival, but something deeper, a shared purpose that bound them together. Ethan felt a sense of resolve, a conviction that had been missing from his life for far too long. Just as they began planning their next move, the radar beeped again, signaling an incoming transmission. Ethan exchanged a wary look with Lyra before accepting the call. The screen flickered to life, revealing the imposing figure of Commander Zarek, his expression twisted with a mix of fury and satisfaction. "You may have escaped once, Cross," he sneered, "but the Syndicate is everywhere. There's nowhere you can run that we won't find you." Ethan met his gaze with a cool, unflinching stare. "We'll see about that, Zarek. Maybe it's time you learned that even the Syndicate has limits." Lyra watched, admiration flickering in her gaze as Ethan continued to outmaneuver their pursuers. But the battle cruiser was still waiting, and the gap to safety was closing fast. Ethan's fingers gripped the controls, every nerve on edge as he pushed the ironbound to its limits. "Prepare for impact," he shouted, his voice strained as he aimed directly at a small opening in the cruiser's formation. It was a risky gambit, but if he timed it just right, they could break through. With a final burst of speed, the ironbound shot forward, squeezing through the gap just as the cruiser unleashed a barrage of fire. Plasma bolts grazed the hull, but they slipped past, emerging from the asteroid field and into open space. The Syndicate ships fell back, unwilling to pursue further, and the radar went blissfully silent. Ethan slumped in his seat, exhaling a long, relieved breath. "We did it," Lyra smiled, the tension melting from her face. "I had no doubts." As they distanced themselves from the asteroid field, Ethan set the ship to autopilot and turned to Lyra. "We can't keep running like this. They'll keep coming after us no matter where we go." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Agreed. We need to go on the offensive, find a way to cripple their operations. If we can take out their command center or disrupt their communications, we might stand a chance." Ethan arched an eyebrow, intrigued. "Do you have any idea where their main base is?" Lyra hesitated, then nodded. "I do. During my time on Earthian intelligence missions, I intercepted data on a hidden Syndicate outpost. It's heavily fortified, but if we can infiltrate it, we might be able to locate their command center, or at least gather intel on their network." Ethan considered this, a spark of hope igniting. "Sounds like a long shot, but it's better than being hunted down." Lyra's face hardened, a fire in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. "The Syndicate has caused too much destruction, too much pain. If there's a chance to take them down, even a small one, we have to take it." He studied her, admiration mingling with a hint of surprise. "You know, Princess, you're not exactly what I expected." She smirked, folding her arms. "I've never fit the mold of a typical Earthian royal. I don't intend to start now." They shared a moment of silent understanding, their alliance no longer just a matter of survival, but something deeper, a shared purpose that bound them together. Ethan felt a sense of resolve, a conviction that had been missing from his life for far too long. Just as they began planning their next move, the radar beeped again, signaling an incoming transmission. Ethan exchanged a wary look with Lyra before accepting the call. The screen flickered to life, revealing the imposing figure of Commander Zarek, his expression twisted with a mix of fury and satisfaction. "You may have escaped once, Cross," he sneered, "but the Syndicate is everywhere. There's nowhere you can run that we won't find you." Ethan met his gaze with a cool, unflinching stare. "We'll see about that, Zarek. Maybe it's time you learned that even the Syndicate has limits." Lyra studied the layout, her gaze sharp. "There's a conduit running along the ceiling. If we disable the lighting, we could use it to get closer." Ethan nodded, impressed by her strategic thinking. "Let's do it." Lyra aimed her blaster at the control panel on the wall, firing a precise shot that plunged the corridor into darkness. The guards immediately shifted into alert mode, their voices low as they attempted to adjust to the sudden change. In the shadows, Ethan and Lyra moved quickly and silently, scaling the side of the wall to reach the overhead conduit. From their vantage point, they watched the guards move cautiously, scanning the area with handheld lights. Ethan signaled to Lyra, and they dropped down simultaneously, taking out the two nearest guards with swift, silent blows. The remaining guards reacted, but Ethan and Lyra were already in motion, weaving through the darkness as they dispatched each enemy with a practiced efficiency. Within minutes, the corridor was clear. Ethan exhaled, lowering his weapon as he glanced at Lyra. "Not bad, Princess." She gave him a wry smile. "You're not so bad yourself." They pushed forward, slipping into the command center just as the emergency lights flickered back on. The room was a sprawling array of monitors and control panels, each displaying feeds from various parts of the Syndicate's network. It was an impressive operation, a testament to the Syndicate's vast reach and influence, but tonight, it was theirs for the taking. Ethan approached the central console, pulling out a small data spike he'd brought for the mission. "Once I plug this in, it'll download everything. Locations, routes, contacts, but it'll take a few minutes, and there's no way we're leaving here undetected after that." Lyra positioned herself near the entrance, ready to fend off any incoming guards. "Do what you have to. I'll cover you." As the data spike began its work, the console hummed, and lines of encrypted information started pouring in. Ethan watched the download progress, every nerve on edge as he anticipated the inevitable response. Sure enough, an alarm blared seconds later, the lights flashing red as the Syndicate's security system went into full lockdown mode. "They're on to us," he muttered, his fingers flying over the console as he worked to expedite the process. "Hold them off as long as you can." Lyra nodded, her blaster raised as footsteps echoed down the corridor. Within seconds, Syndicate guards flooded the entrance, weapons drawn. Lyra met them head-on, her shots precise and controlled as she kept them at bay. She moved with a fluid grace, her every action honed by years of training. Ethan could see why she was a princess. She carried herself with the strength and resolve of a true leader. The guards pressed forward, undeterred by their losses, and the fight grew more intense. Plasma bolts scorched the walls, filling the air with acrid smoke. Lyra fought tirelessly, but the sheer number of enemies was overwhelming. Ethan clenched his teeth, torn between completing the download and helping her. Just as he moved to join her, the console beeped, signaling the download was complete. He pulled out the data spike, slipping it into his belt as he rushed to her side. "We've got what we need. Let's get out of here." Lyra nodded, her face streaked with sweat but resolute. They retreated down the corridor, firing as they moved, keeping the guards at a distance. The station's alarms echoed around them, a constant reminder that their time was running out. They'd taken the Syndicate by surprise, but now the full force of their wrath was bearing down on them. As they reached the docking bay, the sight of Zarek, flanked by Syndicate reinforcements, blocked their path to the Ironbound. His face was twisted in fury, his eyes blazing as he leveled his weapon at them. "You really thought you could waltz in here and steal from us?" Zarek sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're more foolish than I thought." Ethan raised his blaster, his gaze steady. "Seems like we've done a good job so far." Zarek's expression darkened. "You're not leaving here alive, Cross. And as for you, Princess," he spat the word with disdain, "your empire won't even know where to look for your body." Ethan and Lyra exchanged a brief glance, an unspoken resolve passing between them. They'd come this far, and they weren't about to back down now. Without another word, Zarek charged, his forces descending upon them in a whirlwind of gunfire and chaos. Ethan and Lyra fought back with everything they had, their movements in perfect sync as they held their ground. The fight was brutal, each moment a test of their resolve and endurance, but they were outmatched. Ethan could feel the exhaustion creeping in, his muscles aching with every movement. Just when it seemed they were on the verge of being overwhelmed, a flash of energy erupted nearby, scattering the Syndicate forces. Ethan turned to see a familiar face, Rin, the rogue engineer, his cybernetic eye gleaming as he fired at the Syndicate soldiers. "Thought you two could use a hand," he shouted over the chaos. With Rin's help, they pushed back, creating an opening to reach the Ironbound. Ethan ushered Lyra up the ramp as he fired at the remaining guards, covering their retreat. Rin followed, slamming the hatch shut as the ship's engines roared to life. As they blasted off from the outpost, Ethan looked back at Lyra and Rin, relief flooding him. They'd done it. They'd struck a blow against the Syndicate, and with the data they'd stolen, they now held the key to dismantling their operations. But he knew this was just the beginning. He turned to Lyra, a fierce determination in his eyes. "We're not finished yet. The Syndicate's going to come after us with everything they have. But now, we have the advantage." Lyra nodded, her gaze equally resolute. "Then let's make sure they regret ever coming after us." With their mission only growing more dangerous, they braced themselves for what lay ahead, ready to face whatever battles awaited them in the vast, uncharted galaxy. The Ironbound streaked through the dark emptiness of space, engines humming as Ethan, Lyra, and Rin sat in the cockpit, catching their breath. The Syndicate outpost was a distant speck behind them now, and the data spike they had secured pulsed with invaluable intelligence. It contained the inner workings of the Syndicate's operations, giving them insight into their plans, key locations, and command structure. "Let's see what we've got," Ethan murmured, sliding the data spike into the ship's console. The screen flickered to life, lines of encrypted information flooding the display. Rin leaned in, his cybernetic eye whirring as he analyzed the data. "Well, they weren't kidding about the scale of their operation," Rin said, tapping through schematics and communications. "They've got bases spread across half the galaxy, each one feeding resources into something called Project Scourge." Lyra's brows knitted together as she studied the data. Project Scourge. I've heard whispers of it before. It's supposed to be a weapon, a deterrent against any faction that stands in the Syndicate's way. Ethan clenched his fists, anger simmering beneath the surface. "If they succeed, they'll be able to crush entire worlds without opposition." Rin nodded grimly. "And according to these plans, they're nearly there. They've gathered alien tech from dozens of races, even some ancient weapons from the Earthlings. They're building a fleet equipped with weapons that could destabilize the balance of power across the galaxy." Silence fell over the cabin as the gravity of their situation set in. The Syndicate wasn't just a powerful criminal organization. They were an existential threat to every planet and every civilization within their reach. Ethan glanced at Lyra, her face pale but resolute. "We can't let this happen," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "If Project Scourge comes online, no one will be safe." Ethan exhaled, his gaze hardening. "Then we have to stop it. We have their locations, their supply routes. If we strike strategically, we might be able to delay or even dismantle their operations." Rin tapped a section of the screen, pulling up a map marked with red dots across the galaxy. "Their main production facility is located on an uncharted planet, Codex 9. It's isolated, heavily fortified, but if we can sabotage the facility, it would cripple their production capabilities." Lyra's eyes narrowed. "Then Codex 9 becomes our target." Ethan met her gaze, the familiar thrill of a mission with purpose pulsing through him. "It won't be easy, and we'll need allies if we're going to take on a fortress like that." Rin gave a lopsided grin. "I know a few people who'd be more than happy to take a shot at the Syndicate. They've wronged a lot of folks out here." With a plan forming, they set a course for a nearby neutral station to gather reinforcements. Word spread quickly, and by the time they reached the rendezvous point, a small fleet of ships awaited them. These were fighters, smugglers, and renegades from across the galaxy, all eager to see the Syndicate fall. Ethan briefed the ragtag group, laying out the stakes and the risks. "Codex 9 is their heart. We take that out, we cripple their ability to wage war. But be warned, this is a one-way ticket for some of us. They'll throw everything they have to protect it." The group murmured their assent, steeling themselves for the battle ahead. Each ship's crew had their reasons for joining, their grievances with the Syndicate carved deep. As they prepared, Ethan took a moment with Lyra, his voice low and steady. "This is it. One way or another, we end this," he said, his eyes locked on hers. Lyra nodded, a determined smile on her face. "I wouldn't have it any other way." With their makeshift fleet ready, they set out for Codex 9. The planet loomed before them, a rocky, barren world with thick clouds swirling in its atmosphere. Massive structures jutted out from the surface, surrounded by defense turrets and guard ships. Codex 9 was a fortress, a symbol of the Syndicate's power, and the heart of Project Scourge. Ethan led the charge, the Ironbound at the head of the formation. Alarms blared as they entered the planet's atmosphere, and Syndicate fighters swarmed in response. Plasma bolts filled the air, ships weaving and darting as they engaged in fierce dogfights. Ethan's fingers danced over the controls, steering them through the chaos as they advanced on the facility. "Rin, we need those shields down," Ethan shouted over the comm. "Working on it," Rin replied, his voice strained as he hacked into the facility's network. The screen before him displayed layers of encrypted security, each one more complex than the last. But with a triumphant laugh, he broke through, and the facility's shields flickered before collapsing entirely. "Shields are down! Go! Go! Go!" Rin yelled. The Allied ships surged forward, targeting the facility's defenses. Explosions rocked the surface as turrets and ground cannons were destroyed, clearing a path to the heart of Codex 9. Ethan guided the Ironbound closer, landing it just outside the main control center. He and Lyra disembarked, blasters drawn as they made their way inside, flanked by a handful of their allies. The corridors were a labyrinth of steel and shadow, echoing with the distant sounds of battle. Syndicate guards met them at every turn, but Ethan and Lyra fought with a single-minded determination. They pressed forward, pushing through wave after wave of opposition as they closed in on the central command hub. Finally, they reached the core chamber, where the Syndicate's command center was housed. Zarek stood at the center of the room, his face twisted with rage and desperation as he watched them enter. "Cross, Princess Lyra, I should have crushed you both when I had the chance," he sneered, leveling his weapon at them. Ethan raised his blaster, his gaze steady. "The Syndicate's reign ends here, Zarek. You've taken from too many, terrorized too many. We're putting a stop to it." Zarek laughed, a dark, hollow sound. "Do you really think you can stop us? The Syndicate is more than just one base, one facility. We are everywhere." But Ethan's resolve was unshaken. "Then we'll tear down every piece of your empire if we have to." With that, the final battle began. Zarek fought with the desperation of a man with nothing left to lose, his every move calculated and deadly. But Ethan and Lyra fought together, their movements synchronized, their trust in each other absolute. They fought side by side, deflecting Zarek's attacks and striking back with relentless precision. In a climactic struggle, Lyra managed to disarm Zarek, sending his weapon skittering across the floor. Ethan closed in, blaster aimed at Zarek's chest. "It's over," but Zarek's face twisted into a cruel smile. "You may think you've won, but the Syndicate will never die. Others will rise in my place." Ethan didn't waver. "Not if we have anything to say about it." With a final shot, he ended Zarek's reign, the sound of the blaster echoing through the chamber. The facility's alarms blared, signaling the destruction they had wrought, and they knew it was time to leave. As they made their way back to the Ironbound, explosions rippled through the facility, tearing apart the Syndicate's stronghold. Their fleet regrouped, battered but victorious, as Codex 9 collapsed in their wake. As they soared through space, Lyra looked at Ethan, a soft smile on her face. "We did it. We struck a blow that the Syndicate won't recover from anytime soon." Ethan returned her smile, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. "And if they ever try to rebuild, we'll be there to stop them." They gazed out at the vast expanse of stars, their shared journey now one of hope and resilience. The galaxy was vast and dangerous, but they were ready to face whatever came next, together.